August 7th, 1944 near Villers-Bocage, Normandy. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and burnt cordite. Smoke drifted across the bocage, dense green hedgerows turned black by weeks of shelling. The sound of tank engines echoed down the narrow lane, deep, guttural, almost animal. Staff Sergeant Frank Doyle, commander of an M4A1 Sherman, crouched in the mud beside his vehicle, binoculars pressed to his eyes. His unit, part of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, had been ordered to sweep what was left of a German column retreating east. But what lay ahead wasn't retreating, it was waiting. Through the haze, Doyle saw it, a hulking silhouette, angular and monstrous, sitting half-sunken in the road, its turret faced away, long barrel angled toward the trees. "Jesus," he whispered. "That's a Tiger." The tank was immense, its tracks half as tall as a man, its armor pocked but unbroken by dozens of impacts. The infamous Panzerkampfwagen 6, Tiger I, feared across every front, had stopped dead in the lane like a sleeping giant. Private Eddie Carmichael, the driver, climbed out of the Sherman, eyes wide. "You think it's still crewed?" Doyle shook his head slowly. "If it was, we'd already be dead." They advanced cautiously, rifles raised. The closer they got, the clearer the picture became. The Tiger's hatches were open, its crew gone. Inside, the smell of gasoline and cordite was thick, sickly. The dashboard gauges were still smeared with grease, the Maybach HL 230 engine cold and silent. "What the hell happened to it?" Eddie muttered. Doyle climbed up onto the turret, peering inside. Empty canisters littered the floor, jerry cans drained dry. The fuel indicator sat at 0. The beast hadn't been killed, it had starved. He laughed under his breath, half in disbelief. The thing just ran out of gas. Nearby, an officer from the Ordnance Recovery Team approached, notebook in hand. "Congratulations, boys," he said. "You just captured a Tiger intact." Doyle looked back at his Sherman, then at the steel monster before him. "Intact?" he said quietly. "Yeah, but at what cost?" The German tank was a masterpiece of engineering and a logistical disaster waiting to happen. None of them knew it yet, but what they were about to discover inside, that Tiger would change everything they thought they knew about the invincible German armor. August 8th, 1944, Normandy, France. The morning broke grey and humid, with a thin drizzle misting the wreck-strewn countryside. The captured Tiger I sat like a stranded whale beside the hedgerow, its hull streaked with soot and dried mud. The white Balkenkreuz, Germany's black iron cross, was still faintly visible beneath a film of dust. An ordnance recovery team from the U.S. 2nd Armored Division arrived before sunrise. Their job: examine, document, and recover what was left of the most feared tank in Europe. Staff Sergeant Frank Doyle and his crew watched as technicians swarmed over the vehicle. One man climbed onto the turret with a tape measure. Another pried open an access hatch with a crowbar. The Tiger's engine compartment groaned in protest. "Look at that armor," one of the mechanics said, running a gloved hand along the turret side. 3 inches thick, solid steel. Our 75 can't even scratch that. "No." Another soldier spat into the mud. No wonder the Krauts thought they were invincible. Doyle wasn't listening. He was focused on the interior, the cockpit of the beast. He climbed inside, flashlight flickering across the cramped compartment. Everything was painted a dull cream color, splattered with oil and carbon soot. Spent shell casings rattled under his boots. The Maybach HL 230 P45 engine loomed behind a steel bulkhead, 12 cylinders, 700 horsepower of precision German machinery. But the smell told the truth before the gauges did. Burned fuel. Empty tanks. A clipboarded officer leaned into the hatch beside him. "Our guys estimate she burned through 500 litres every 100 kilometres. That's, what, around 120 miles to a full tank." Doyle whistled. "That's it? You're kidding me." "Nope, that's all she wrote. Runs like a king for 2 hours, then dies like a mule." Doyle shook his head, wiping grease from his hand. "So that's why they left it. She's not beaten, she's thirsty." The officer grinned. A steel giant with the appetite of a locomotive. We'll get her to the depot. Let the brass tear it apart. By noon, a recovery tractor was hooking chains around the Tiger's front tow eyes. It took 2 Sherman recovery vehicles just to budge it. The men watched in awe as it finally groaned forward, treads grinding reluctantly through the mud. Eddie Carmichael laughed. "Hell, Frank, we could have outrun this thing on bicycles." Yeah, Doyle said, lighting a cigarette. "But if it had gas, we wouldn't be here talking." He looked back at the Tiger's massive gun, the 8.8 centimeters K 36 liters divided by 56, the same weapon that had cut through Allied armor like paper across North Africa and the Eastern Front. It could kill a Sherman before an American tanker even knew it was being aimed at. But now, that weapon sat silent. The war's deadliest predator immobilized not by enemy fire, but by its own hunger. Doyle took one last look as the Tiger was hauled away toward the rear. "Guess that's the problem with building monsters," he muttered. "They eat too much." August 15th, 1944, Allied Ordnance Depot, Issigny-sur-Mer, France. Rain drummed on the tin roof of the maintenance hangar as the captured Tiger I rolled inside on squealing tracks. Floodlights flickered across its battered hull, illuminating scars from countless battles, gouges where shells had ricocheted, scorch marks from near misses, and mud packed thick between its interlocking road wheels. Around it gathered a half-dozen men in grease-stained coveralls, American engineers, British liaison officers, and one curious French mechanic who crossed himself quietly before touching the tank. Staff Sergeant Frank Doyle stood nearby, arms folded, watching with fascination. "She's still a monster," he said softly. The lead engineer, Captain Henry Walker, nodded. "Let's see what makes it tick." Walker's team spent 2 days refueling, checking compression, and cleaning filters. The Maybach HL 230 P45 engine, an engineering marvel of precision pistons and aluminum heads, finally coughed to life on the 3rd morning. The sound filled the hangar like thunder. "Good God," muttered one soldier, covering his ears. "Sounds like a factory on fire." The Tiger shook as the engine roared to full throttle, clouds of black smoke belching from the twin exhaust stacks. But even at idle, Walker's gauges told the story. The fuel meter plummeted like a stone. "Note this down," Walker shouted over the noise. "Fuel consumption 5 gallons per mile at road speed, almost double off-road. That's roughly 120 miles to a full tank on flat ground." Doyle blinked. "You're telling me this thing burns more gas than a convoy of trucks?" "Exactly," Walker replied grimly. "And Germany doesn't have the gas to feed it. Every time one of these moves, it drinks a supply train dry." The Tiger lurched forward under its own power, tracks clattering on the concrete. Its transmission whined as it turned in place, laborious, heavy, straining against its own weight. The armor 100 millimeters of Krupp steel on the front plate made it nearly invincible to Allied 75 millimeters guns. But that same armor made it slow, loud, and perpetually hungry. As the tank came to a stop, the engineers approached, jotting notes and snapping photographs. The British liaison, Major Alan Barlow, shook his head in disbelief. "It's magnificent, I'll grant you that," he said, tapping the side of the turret. "But it's not a weapon of war, it's a monument. Germany's building fortresses when they need horses." Doyle chuckled. "Yeah. Meanwhile, our Shermans run 3 times the distance, and we can fit 5 of them on a ship for every one of these." Barlow smirked. "Quantity has a quality all its own." "Ho!" They circled the Tiger like archaeologists studying a fossil, awed by its craftsmanship, but recognizing the fatal flaw carved into its design. The Germans had built the Tiger to dominate the battlefield, but in the real world of logistics, mud, and fuel shortages, it was already obsolete. As the engine sputtered and died, the hangar fell silent except for the pinging of cooling metal. Doyle exhaled slowly. "So that's it, huh? The beast of Europe can't even drive from Paris to the front line." Walker shut his notebook. "No, Sergeant. It can kill anything it sees, but it can't get there to see it." The men stepped back, watching the Tiger sit motionless under the fluorescent light, a masterpiece of engineering undone by the simplest of weaknesses. Outside, the rumble of Sherman engines filled the air, heading east toward the front. They didn't have the Tiger's armor or its fearsome gun, but they had fuel, numbers, and reliability, and in war, that was what kept armies moving. Doyle looked back one last time at the captured tank. "Guess the Tiger's teeth were sharper than its stomach," he muttered. August 20th, 1944, Allied Field Headquarters near St. Lo, Normandy. The midday sun glared over the rolling Norman fields as tankers from the U.S. 2nd Armored Division gathered around a large wooden table. Spread before them were photographs, blueprints, and detailed notes from the captured Tiger Rise examination. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and coffee fuel and caffeine, the lifeblood of the Armored Corps. Major Henry Walker, the same ordnance officer who had tested the Tiger at Isigny, stood at the front of the group. Behind him, a chalkboard bore 2 words underlined in bold: power versus practicality. "All right, gentlemen," he began, tapping his pointer against the diagram. "This is the Tiger. The Germans call it the Panzerkampfwagen 6. 88mm main gun, frontal armor up to 100mm thick, 60 tons of pure steel." A low whistle ran through the group. Walker nodded. "Yes, it's impressive. On paper, it's the most powerful tank in the world. But here's the truth. They don't print in propaganda." He flipped a page on the easel. The next sheet showed fuel statistics. "It carries 540 gallons of gasoline. That's enough to take it under ideal conditions about 120 miles. That's it. 1 day's march, maybe less. On rough terrain, try 70. Someone in the back laughed. "That's not a tank, that's a furnace." Walker smiled thinly. "Exactly. And here's the kicker. Germany's supply lines are crumbling. Every drop of fuel that goes into one of these monsters means 3 Panzer IVs stay parked. By late 44, they couldn't move their tanks without stealing aviation fuel from the Luftwaffe." He let that sink in, then gestured to a photo of an American M4 Sherman. "Now, look at ours. Lighter armor, smaller gun, sure. But the Sherman can go 250 miles on a tank of fuel. Its engine is simple, repairable in the field, and every part is standardized. When it breaks, you swap it out and roll again." Staff Sergeant Frank Doyle, sitting near the front, raised a hand. "So basically, sir, the Germans built a Tiger that can't hunt." Walker chuckled. "That's one way to put it. They built a masterpiece that couldn't live off the land. Every Tiger required 2 recovery vehicles, 3 fuel trucks, and an entire logistics chain just to keep it moving. That's not a tank. That's a liability." The men laughed, but Walker's tone grew serious. "Make no mistake, the Tiger's gun will still tear a Sherman apart from a mile away. If it's fueled and dug in, it's deadly. But wars aren't won by the best machine. They're won by the one that shows up on time and keeps moving forward." Doyle leaned back, thinking about the wreck they'd found: the empty jerrycans, the burned-out engine, the crew gone on foot. "Guess they built for fear," he said softly. "We built for endurance." Walker nodded. "Exactly. The Tiger was a king on the chessboard. But the Sherman was the player's hand. One breaks down, the other wins the war." He dismissed the men, and the clatter of chairs filled the tent. Outside, engines started lines of olive-drab Shermans rumbling to life, ready to roll east again. Doyle stepped into the sunlight, glancing at the convoy. He could smell diesel and dust, the scent of movement, of victory by logistics. He looked to the horizon, where France stretched toward Germany. Somewhere out there, more Tigers waited, but now he knew their secret. "They'll run out of fuel before we run out of tanks," he murmured. Behind him, Walker folded his reports, his voice calm but certain. "And that," he said, "is how you beat a machine that everyone thinks is unbeatable." September 1944, near Aachen, Germany. The ground trembled beneath the treads of advancing Shermans. Columns of olive-drab armor rolled east through ruined villages, their white stars smeared with dust and soot. Every few miles they passed another burnt-out wreck, sometimes German, sometimes American. But when the soldiers saw a tiger lying silent in the road, even destroyed, they always slowed down. It wasn't just another tank, it was the tiger. Staff Sergeant Frank Doyle had seen 3 by now, 1 captured, 2 dead. But this one was different. Its turret was blown clean off, lying 20 yards from the hull. The blackened frame of a panther sat nearby, as if guarding the carcass. "Looks like our flyboys caught this one," said Private Eddie Carmichael, climbing down from their Sherman. "Yeah," Doyle muttered. "Doesn't take a genius to see why they're running out of these things." He walked closer, brushing ash off the tiger's side. The armor was pitted with bomb fragments, but it was still solid, cold, and heavy as a bunker. Even destroyed, it radiated menace. One of the British liaison officers, Major Alan Barlow, the same man from the depot, arrived in a jeep, notebook in hand. "Another one down?" "Yeah," Doyle said. "Blew its turret sky high." Barlow examined the wreck, nodding slowly. "You know, back home, our boys still talk about these things like they're invincible. But half of them never even reached the front. Broken gearboxes, empty fuel tanks. They're killing themselves faster than we can." Doyle gave a short laugh. "Tell that to the guy who faced one head-on." Barlow smirked. "True, but this is how the myth dies, not with a fight, but with a stall." He tapped his pen against the charred hull. 200,000 Reichsmarks per tank, 10,000 man-hours to build. Every one of these costs Germany a trainload of fuel and a month of production. You Americans can roll out 5 Shermans in the time it takes them to make one of these. Doyle stared at the massive 88mm gun, its barrel drooping like a dead arm. "They built a masterpiece," he said. "We built a workhorse." "Exactly," Barlow said, "and workhorses win wars." A convoy of half-tracks rumbled past, soldiers waving from the back. One shouted, "Hey, Sarge, you gonna bring that thing home as a souvenir?" Doyle grinned. "Only if someone else pays for the gas." "Me." Laughter rippled through the group. But behind the jokes was a quiet understanding. The Tiger's reign of terror had been built on reputation, not sustainability. Its first victims had been caught by surprise, yes, but by 1944, the Allies had adapted, better tactics, better coordination, and overwhelming production. Above them, the distant drone of P-47 Thunderbolts filled the sky, hunting the next column of retreating German armor. Barlow folded his notebook, glancing toward the east. "Germany's building wonders while fighting with empty tanks," he said softly. "And we're flooding the front with fuel and steel. It's not a fair fight anymore." Doyle looked at the dead tiger one last time. War never is. Not when you can't afford to move your best weapons. As they climbed back into their Sherman, the radio crackled with new orders. The second armored was advancing again, pushing into the fatherland itself. The engines roared to life, and as the convoy rolled past the wrecked Tiger, its burned hull cast a long shadow across the road. But this time, no one slowed down to stare. The myth of invincibility had already been left behind in the mud. October 1944, the Siegfried Line, Western Germany. Rain fell in sheets across the frontier, turning the fields into rivers of brown sludge. The American advance had slowed to a crawl. Steel dragons, Shermans, half-tracks, fuel trucks ground forward through the mud, engines groaning under the weight of the push into Germany's final defensive wall. Staff Sergeant Frank Doyle's Sherman, Lucky 7, idled in a column of tanks snaking toward Aachen. The crew huddled inside, wet, tired, and reeking of diesel and gunpowder. Outside, mechanics refueled the vehicles one by one from long convoys of 5-gallon jerry cans. "Refuel every 50 miles, Eddie Carmichael muttered from the driver's seat. "Feels like all we ever do is gas up and roll again." Doyle smirked. "Be grateful we can refuel, Eddie. Those Tigers don't get this far anymore." He wasn't exaggerating. Intelligence reports confirmed it. Most German heavy armor was being abandoned before even reaching the front. Some broke down. Others simply ran out of fuel in the forests east of the Rhine. The Wehrmacht's supply lines, once the envy of Europe, had collapsed into chaos. At HQ, a map table told the story in red and blue lines. Colonel Paul Grayson, the operations officer, jabbed a pencil toward a cluster of black crosses near Cologne. "That's where their armor died," he said. "Not destroyed by air, not by artillery, just out of gas." A logistics officer shook his head. "They can't even tow them back anymore. Every gallon they have goes to the trucks trying to escape." The colonel looked to his aides. "And what about our tanks?" "Shermans are still rolling, sir. Supply lines intact, fuel steady." He grinned faintly. "That's why we win. Wars are fought by mechanics, not heroes." Meanwhile, out on the muddy line, Doyle's tank crested a hill and stopped. From the ridge, he could see the twisted forms of 4 German Tigers lying scattered across a field below, 2 burned out, 1 missing its turret, 1 half sunk in a crater. Around them, German infantry trudged on foot, rifles slung, too tired to look back. Carmichael whistled. "What a waste of metal." Doyle watched quietly. "That's not metal, Eddie. That's ambition that outran its gas tank." A distant thunder rolled across the valley, the sound of P-47 seconds strafing a retreating convoy. The war was now one of motion. Whoever could move won. Whoever stalled died. Later that evening, under the orange glow of a field depot, Doyle talked with a British officer who had come to inspect one of the captured Tigers. "Magnificent, isn't it?" the officer said, running his hand along the thick, cold armor. "It's like something out of a nightmare." Doyle nodded. "Yeah, but it's a nightmare that can't stay awake without fuel." The officer chuckled. "That's the irony, isn't it? The Germans built perfection, and perfection starved." As mechanics worked through the night refueling and repairing, Doyle leaned against his Sherman and looked toward the front. Somewhere beyond those dark hills, another Tiger was waiting, its engine idling, its crew praying they'd have enough fuel to make it home. He flicked his cigarette into the mud. "Doesn't matter how hard they fight," he said softly. "You can't win a war if your tanks die of thirst." Now, the convoy engines roared again, and the line of Shermans began to move east slowly, relentlessly, unstoppable. Above them, the night sky glowed faintly red from burning fuel dumps, marking the end of Germany's dream of mechanized domination. The Tigers had roared once. Now, they were just statues, giants stranded in the mud. March 1945, east of the Rhine River, Germany. The snow was gone now, replaced by wet fields and the acrid smell of retreat. Germany's once proud panzer divisions were shadows of themselves, scattered across villages and woods, their tanks abandoned in ditches and barns. Staff Sergeant Frank Doyle's Sherman crossed a rickety bridge under the grey morning sky. Below, a river of refugees trudged eastward, soldiers without helmets, civilians with carts, and horses pulling what little fuel remained. The German war machine had ground itself to exhaustion. "Contact ahead," called Eddie Carmichael, scanning through the periscope. Doyle raised his binoculars. Parked at the edge of the next hamlet sat a Tiger I, its engine cover open, steam rising from within. No crew, no guards, just silence. They approached cautiously. The closer they came, the clearer the scene became. The Tiger's turret bore the black number 231, its gun elevated as if in one last defiant gesture. Inside, the driver's seat was empty, the floor littered with ration tins and an open maintenance manual. "Fuel drums are dry again," Doyle murmured. "That's the 4th one this week." A war correspondent accompanying their unit snapped photographs, circling the vehicle with awe. "These things used to scare entire battalions," he said. "Now they can't even make it out of town." Doyle climbed onto the hull, running a gloved hand over the scarred steel. He found the logbook still tucked behind the radio panel. The last entry, written in precise German script, read, "Fuel reserves exhausted, engine overheated, ordered to destroy vehicle, but charges unavailable." He closed it quietly. "They couldn't even blow it up," he said. Nearby, a supply sergeant shook his head. 60 tons of armor and it dies standing still. Hell of a symbol. By dusk, the engineers had hooked the Tiger to a recovery truck. Its treads squealed as it was dragged toward the Allied depot, one more trophy in a war where endurance had finally beaten design. That night, Doyle sat with his crew by a small fire, writing in his field journal. The flames flickered across their tired faces. They built the best tank in the world, he wrote, but forgot the world runs on fuel. Eddie looked up from cleaning his sidearm. Think they'll ever build something like that again? Doyle thought for a moment. Maybe. But I hope whoever does remembers power's not just what you make. It's what you can keep moving. In the distance, artillery thundered Germany's final defense collapsing inch by inch. The Tiger, once the terror of every Allied tanker, had become a relic of a fading empire. A week later, across the Rhine, General Omar Bradley stood before reporters. Behind him, rows of captured German armor stretched for miles, Panthers, King Tigers, and the last of the original Tigers, each tagged for study. Bradley gestured toward them and said simply, "They built monuments. We built momentum." It was the most accurate eulogy the Tiger would ever receive. May 1945, Allied Ordnance Yard, Koblenz, Germany. The war was over. The guns had fallen silent, the smoke cleared, and Europe lay in ruins. In a sprawling depot outside Koblenz, hundreds of captured German tanks sat lined in rows, mute steel giants under the pale spring Sunday. Among them rested a handful of Tiger Eyes, their thick armor scarred but intact, engines cold forever. American ordnance officers moved among them with notebooks and cameras, cataloguing the remnants of Hitler's armored dream. Some spoke in hushed tones, almost reverent. Others laughed at the absurdity of it all. Millions of Reichsmarks, thousands of man-hours, all stranded by empty fuel tanks. Staff Sergeant Frank Doyle stood beside one of the captured Tigers, hands in his pockets. Its once feared 88mm gun pointed harmlessly toward the sky. The markings on the side were faded, the iron cross barely visible through grime. Beside him, Major Henry Walker, the ordnance expert who had tested the first Tiger months earlier, was dictating notes to a clerk. "Final assessment," he said calmly. "The Tiger I represents the pinnacle of German armored design but also the height of over-engineering, superior in armor and firepower, yet critically crippled by fuel demand, complexity, and production cost." Doyle smirked. "So, a genius idea built by people who forgot there's a war going on." Walker chuckled. "Something like that." He turned serious again. "It's ironic, Sergeant. The Tiger terrified the world, but in the end, it lost not because we built better tanks, but because we built more that could keep moving." He gestured toward a nearby line of M4 Shermans, their paint chipped, their tracks still dusted with Rhine mud. "Those are ugly, loud, undergunned, and they won the war." Doyle nodded slowly. "Guess reliability beats perfection." Walker smiled faintly. "Always does." Nearby, a crew of soldiers cranked one of the Tiger's engines for testing. The Maybach roared to life for the last time, coughing smoke like a dying beast. For a few moments, its growl filled the air, a ghostly echo of battlefields past. Then, as fuel ran out, the engine sputtered, choked, and died. Silence returned. Doyle exhaled. Still thirsty to the end, Walker closed his notebook. "And that's the lesson, Sergeant. The Tiger's curse wasn't its enemies, it was its own appetite." They turned away, leaving the machine to rest among hundreds of others silent witnesses to the downfall of a nation that had mistaken brilliance for sustainability. As Doyle walked toward his waiting jeep, he glanced back one last time. The sunlight glinted off the Tiger's steel hide, reflecting for just a second the ghost of its former power. "Beautiful," he murmured, "but doomed." Oh. The jeep rumbled to life, its simple gasoline engine purring, easily ready to drive another 200 miles on a tank. In that moment, the difference between victory and defeat had never been clearer. The Germans built monsters that couldn't feed themselves. The Americans built machines that never stopped moving. and when history turned its final page, it wasn't the roar of the tiger that echoed, it was the steady rumble of the Sherman, rolling ever forward.